All right, welcome back. Now let's continue the discussion on the new GDP figures, and now being joined on the program by Johnson Chukwu, who is the CEO of Cowrie Asset Management. He joins us via Skype from Uyo, the capital of Akwa Ibom State. Thank you very much, Mr. Chukwu, for joining us on the program. First off, what do you make of the GDP figures?
Thank you, DEJI, for having me. My first take when I saw the GDP figure is that at least the country's economy is gradually crawling out of the recession we witnessed in the previous last year. And given the fact that we saw a GDP growth of about 4.03%, granted that is a slight slowdown compared to the 5.01%, but we expected that because the 5.01% we saw in the second quarter of this year was partly propelled by what we call base effect. Recall that the economy contracted in second quarter of last year by 6.1%. So that dip, and remember you're measuring what year on year, so you're looking at what was the size of the economy as at the end of second quarter of last year and what was it at the end of second quarter this year. So, and that was why you saw a sharp growth of 5.01%. But the economy similarly contracted by 3.6% in the third quarter of last year. But if you compare the contraction of 3.6% to 6.1%, you see a wide gap, which is why the growth we saw in the third quarter was not as steep as it was in the second quarter, because of that base effect, we are now growing from a higher base, unlike when you had a major dip and we are growing from a deep position, a major contraction. So the contraction we saw in the third quarter of last year was not as deep as the second quarter of last year. And if you measure the GDP as at the third quarter last year compared to what it was at the end of the third quarter this year, that was why we saw a growth of only 4.03%. So for me, it was still a positive growth. Granted, it wasn't as high as the second quarter growth, but nobody expected the second quarter growth.
So let's talk about the non-oil sector. I mean, I know I have spoken to you a lot of times on this, and you've always been very categorical that, look, we need to do something about our non-oil sector. We need to get the non-oil sector to be the key driver of the economy. And somehow it's like it's now beginning to happen. I mean, you compare the growth of the non-oil sector to the contraction we saw in the oil sector. Tell me how excited you are by this growth. I mean, growing by 5.44% in the third quarter of 2021.
Well, the good thing is that the non-oil sector is actually the sector that creates employment in the country. These are the major sectors that have more impactful social benefit that relates to the economy. If you look at the oil sector, the value addition, there's no value addition in the Nigerian oil and gas sector because you don't have the refineries, you don't have the petrochemicals, so you're largely producing crude and exporting crude. And that was why, because of a decline in crude production from 1.61% to 1.57%, you saw a contraction in the oil and gas sector by as much as 10.7%. But back to the non-oil sector, like I said, these are the sectors that propel the economy. If you look at the agriculture sector, for instance, it accounts for 29.9% of the GDP, almost a third of the GDP. And granted, that sector still grew, but we have seen a consistent slowdown in its growth rate. We saw the growth rate decline further from 1.3% to 1.22%. The other sector that actually grew, I was quite happy that the manufacturing sector grew by a higher percentage. And the manufacturing sector is one of the major sectors that will drive economic activity, drive diversification of the economy. Then the ICT sector has remained quite strong. We saw an improvement in growth compared to what we saw last quarter where the growth rate slowed down. So we are now seeing a further recovery of that growth rate. Of course, if you saw the figures published by the major telcos on their revenues showing that they are making so much revenue from data services, you can relate with the fact that the ICT sector was expected to grow faster in third quarter than it did in the second quarter. Then other sectors, trade sector has turned positive. We saw a positive growth in the second quarter of this year, from a sector that has consistently declined over a long period of time, and that positive was sustained in the third quarter of this year. Granted, the growth rate was slower, but these factors, like I said, have more impactful effect on the economy, and that it is these sectors that you want to drive growth, and that's why I'm happy that that sector contributed about 92.51% of the total GDP contribution in the third quarter of this year.
Now, look, it's one thing to talk about GDP, and it's like that all over the world. It's one thing to talk about GDP. It's a different ball game when it comes to how these positive GDPs would translate to, better living standards for people and all of that. So how do we reconcile, for instance, this growth in GDP rate with what we have, currently the prevailing situation in society, especially when you look at the issue of inflation, for instance, even though it's moderating, but the truth is that you look at food inflation, it's still very high. And here we have agriculture doing well in terms of GDP. So what do we need to do to ensure that this GDP, this growth in GDP translates to better living for the common man?
Well, Deji, if you look at the GDP and you look at the inflation rate, the reason why Nigerians are complaining is because we've seen a very high inflation rate, even at 15.99%, that's still quite high. It simply means the value of your money has actually lost value to the tune of 15.55% within the last 1 year, 15.99% within 1 year. And going further, trying to reconcile the high inflation rate and the fact that the GDP is growing and wondering why the GDP growth is not yet translating into better living standard for Nigerians. Recall that I had mentioned earlier that the GDP growth in agricultural sector is slowing down and consistently slowed down for the past 4 quarters. We're now dealing with a growth rate of 1.2% in agricultural sector. And the agricultural sector accounts for 30% of the GDP. But now translating that the food prices, you also recognize that what we are seeing in agriculture is still expanding, but it's expanding at a slower pace, at a very slow pace. And that is manifesting in the quantity of goods and services being produced. Remember, our population is growing about 3%. So it simply means that the number of people who are being added to eat the food being produced is increasing by 3%, while the food being produced is increasing by 1.2%. And you can see a gap. And that gap is what is translating in food inflation rate of 18.34%. Because we are not producing as much quantity of food as the number of people who are being added in the population to consume that food. And this is largely because of the displacement of farmers in the farming belts. The high insecurity situation we have in the North Central, Northeast, and Northwest has manifested in low food production. In the fact that it accounts for 30% of the GDP, but we are seeing a contraction in GDP growth rate as it relates to food agriculture. And that you also see a very high food inflation rate of 18.34%. So that's why Nigerians are not yet feeling the impact of the GDP. But the good thing is that if you have a consistent GDP growth rate, it eventually translates into higher level of employment, and then people who are earning income will have reasonable, better not necessarily purchasing power, but in terms they have income, even if that income is partly being eroded. But what we have is a situation where you have high unemployment rate, you have high inflation rate, and the few people who are employed are the ones taking care of the entire family, because we don't have effective social safety nets in the country.
Absolutely, I agree with you, and no doubt the issue of security is a very big deal. And then one thing we keep shying away from talking about, the truth is that we need to do something about our population growth. At the rate we're growing, I really wonder if we'll be able to sustain it. Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson Chukwu, for joining us on the program and for sharing your thoughts with us.
My pleasure.
All right, that's how much we can take on the program this week. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.